Alright guys, how's it going? Last week's video was supposed to be an analysis on the upcoming game console APUs, the GPUs and CPUs inside of the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5. At that time we just had been handed some vague numbers by Microsoft. We knew that they had a 12 teraflops RDNA 2 based GPU and an 8-core 16-thread Zen 2 CPU. Sony, on the other hand, were being very quiet, and I've been doing this long enough to know that being quiet more often than not means they are losing in important metrics and are figuring out how best to put that message across. As usual, I had decided to do a short history of the previous consoles, PlayStation 2, the Xbox, detailing the CPU and GPU chips inside of them. And by the time we got to the current PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, I had decided to tell the story of how that came through AMD's new semi-custom strategy, which really got off the ground thanks to Sony's and Microsoft's business. And I had reached the point where I was ready to discuss the new consoles and my thoughts on what we'd see in each. The research was running a little bit late though, and I felt a bit tired, so I decided to just take the weekend off for a change. But on waking Monday morning, switching on my PC, the first thing I saw was the complete Xbox Series X specs had been revealed over at Digital Foundry, and also this excellent video by Richard. And so the 53 sources that I had researched for the video were now pretty much useless, and I decided that by now I might as well just wait on getting Sony's response. Didn't have to wait very long, only 2 more days to get that, and in this video I'll go over the information and analyse what we have. It's difficult to know where to start with all this new information, but as Microsoft were first with the major details, it only seems fair to give the Xbox Series X the premiere. And on the Xbox website, the article, Xbox Series X, a closer look at the technology powering the next generation, had plenty of details. Jason Ronald, the Director of Product Management for the Series X, said, "While the Xbox Series X will deliver a massive increase in GPU performance, and continue to redefine and advance the state of art in graphics with new capabilities such as hardware-accelerated ray tracing, we don't believe this generation will be defined by graphics or resolution alone." I'm always looking for quotes that perhaps betray the true story, or at least a concern. And when I read this, I wondered, did that mean the PlayStation 5 would have a more powerful APU than the Series X? Which in my previous 2 videos on the topic, I made that abundantly clear that I did not believe that would be the case. As you know, I've always been right behind the GitHub leaks, and firmly believed the Series X would be the more powerful of the 2, at least in terms of graphics. So for me this was a little bit surprising to read. Above Jason's comments though, we were provided with a awesome render of the Series X system on chip, and zooming in, it is a lot smaller than I expected, coming in at only 360 square millimeters, whereas my expectation was 400mm plus. I'll have thoughts on what that means later on in the video though. Now the blue rectangles, these are 2 quad-core, octo-thread, custom Zen 2 based CPUs. And this setup here with 2 different complexes, that is similar to the previous generation Xbox One. And that's not really too surprising, as we do know that the Zen 2 chiplet is an 8-core 16-thread chip with 2 core complexes. And I think it's probably best to look at these like this. Each of these blue rectangles here, basically one of those core complexes. Though this longish rectangular layout is more similar to Zen 1 than Zen 2. The much larger green area is the RDNA 2 based GPU. And presumably this part in the centre is the command processor. And flanked on either side could be level 2 cache maybe? It's difficult to know for sure. But it certainly looks different from the Navi 10 GPU, which has a command processor, and the front end is in fact in the centre of the GPU. Down the edges we can see the memory buses on either side, and at the bottom and sides we've got some fixed function stuff and I/O. It's all pretty tightly packed together, and Microsoft has managed to squeeze an awful lot of AMD's current intellectual property in there. And of course where it gets interesting was the performance specs of each of these parts. For a long time I have assumed that the GPU would be 56 compute units, running very close to 1700 MHz boost clock, and that would give us 12.186 teraflops. And the second assumption with this would be that the GPU would actually be 60 compute units in total, but only 56 would be getting used. there'd be an extra 4 compute units used for redundancy purposes. But it turns out that the GPU portion is slightly smaller than that. It's 56 compute units in total, but only 52 are being used. And of course that means to reach this 12 teraflops number, clock speeds need to be higher than 1700 MHz. 1825 MHz with 52 compute units gives us 12.147 teraflops. Very slightly down in what was assumed, but as you'll hear later, having a higher clock speed and less compute units can actually be slightly better from a performance perspective. The problem with teraflops calculations though is that they are based on the peak boost clock of the GPU. And up until recently, my main concern over the Series X GPU was that Microsoft were just giving a fantasy boost clock while the GPU ran a bit slower on average. Not so though. Microsoft went to some lengths to ensure that everyone understood that this 1825 MHz was a locked clock speed. There's no boost at all, there's no up to. The GPU runs at 1825 MHz. Locked. And I probably don't need to tell most of you watching this as your PC enthusiasts, but the 5700 XT, which has only 36 compute units, probably consume over 200 watts at that locked clock speed. So this performance per watt uplift for RDNA 2 over RDNA 1 must indeed be close to this enormous 50% claim by AMD that they made during their recent financial analyst day. If the GPU performance was a surprise, the CPU performance could be even more so. For the past year or two, every leak we have seen suggested that these Zen 2 cores would be clocked around 3.2 GHz. And Microsoft actually has 2 performance modes for these 8 Zen 2 cores. The first mode allows for 3.8 GHz, but that's without simultaneous multi-threading. In other words, when the CPU cores are operating as an 8-core chip rather than an 8-core 16-thread one. There is a second mode, of course, though, which allows for 3.6 GHz with SMT. And while Mode 2 looks like a no-brainer to us, and regarding performance this will be way more performant than 3.8 with 8 cores. Remember that most game console developers, they're not really used to working with SMT. Those Jaguar cores that we see in both the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, that's just 8 cores again without SMT. So this 3.8 GHz mode will likely be used for compatibility reasons and early next generation games. And games that come later should start using more SMT. But there was yet another surprise for the CPU again, because both those numbers that I just talked about, those are also locked clock speeds, so zero boost clock. And this is pretty unreal when you think about it. If you just call this 3.6 GHz the base clock, then the Ryzen 7 3700X, at its base clock of 3.6 GHz, that's a 65 watt TDP chip. Basically a perfect match for the Xbox Series X 8-core CPU, but more typically a game console CPU would run closer to 30 watts. How then is Microsoft able to get such seemingly unlikely numbers out of their hardware? Clearly, RDNA 2 is a large efficiency leap forward over RDNA 1. Microsoft have also increased the Series X power supply to 300 watts, so that's up a fair bit on the 245 watts of the Xbox One X. And finally, the chassis has clearly been designed for higher performance compared to previous generation consoles. To start with, there is a lot more volume, nearly 50% more volume than the Xbox One X, and it's got a dual motherboard design for keeping the hot parts separate. And that is a pretty large heatsink covering all the major components. There's enough space for air to flow through it, and everything is cooled by a large fan. This level of cooling and design has not really been common in a game console. In fact, consoles often have certain compromises simply because they generally sell way better when they hit the lower price points. And one issue that I long struggled with, even way back with my Evolving Master Plan video, when I decided that only chiplets made sense to me, I wondered how the next-gen consoles would cope with the extra demands on memory bandwidth. HBM was never an option. There was a rumour about it once, but that was always going to be garbage. That is still far too expensive for a game console, and I believed that a 256-bit GDDR6 bus would not be enough bandwidth for such a powerful GPU. But the problem then was, 384-bit bus, that could be too large on 7nm. And it would also require a large amount of memory, likely 24GB, as 12GB wouldn't be enough. In the case of the Series X memory bus, Microsoft took a middle option, got 16GB GDDR6 on a 320-bit memory bus, and 10GB of that runs at 560GB per second, with the final 6GB running at 336GB per second. And regarding this 320-bit bus, we can see 256-bit down both sides. And these two blocks above the Zen 2 cores, that looks like the final 64-bit to me. Microsoft says that games will have the full fast 10GB available to them, and also 3.5GB of this slower stuff, with 2.5GB of the slower stuff being reserved for the operating system. The CPU will also require a fair amount of memory for games too, and that should obviously come off of this slower RAM. Everything is a trade-off here, and Microsoft appear to have taken quite a smart option of ensuring enough bandwidth for their extremely potent GPU, while still being able to keep the cost down. But just how potent is that GPU? The Xbox team showcased a technical demo of Gears of War 5 using full PC ultra spec settings, which included higher resolution textures and higher resolution volumetric fog, as well as a 50% higher particle count than the PC Ultra specs allowed. And as Digital Foundry discovered, this 2-week-old Gears of War 5 port was already performing on the level of an RTX 2080. We also saw demos of upscaling in Gears of War 5, with Jason Rayner noting that the game is already running over 100 frames per second. And last but definitely not least, everyone's new favourite tech. I am of course talking about ray tracing. The details were a little bit thin on the ground, and we got to see Minecraft in action. Running fully path traced, so the entire game running ray traced on the Series X. Now obviously Minecraft is not a difficult game to fully path trace, as it looks like something from 1997, and we have already seen it running on Nvidia cards some time ago. I'll talk more about the ray tracing aspect of both consoles once I've got more information, but it looks like it is indeed fixed function hardware for BVH traversal, similar to what Nvidia has with Turing. How many gigaarrays it's capable of? Who knows? There was one more thing actually, and that is that the GPU is also capable of running 8-bit and 4-bit integer operations, which are most widely used today with machine learning and AI. And this entire system on chip is built on TSMC's 7nm enhanced process, which is almost certainly an evolution on the 7P that they've had since last year. And that's also what the Navi chips were built on, 7P. The amount of grunt that Microsoft have packed into this is absolutely enormous. 8 Zen 2 cores and at least RTX 2080 performance. All this in an area that is less than half the size of the RTX 2080 Ti. For the rest of the reveal, of particular note was the 1TB SSD, which allows for some neat stuff like quickly resuming games. You can pause a game, you can switch to another one, and the game you were playing will be quickly offloaded to the SSD, ready to be reloaded just as fast if you want to pick it up again later. And this is quite a big difference from running something from a Blu-ray. And I could talk about Microsoft's dynamic latency input, or DLI, and their auto low latency mode, ALLM, and the ray traced audio, but if I did that, I'd be here for hours. And so, it's time to move on to what we got from Sony instead. Mark Cerny took to the stage and talked for around about 50 minutes on the road to the PS5. And one of the first slides we saw said, balancing evolution and revolution. And by now I was fairly sure about what was coming next. Out of these 50 minutes, the PlayStation 5's GPU and CPU were discussed for 12 of them. And Mark in fact started by talking about their SSD, claiming it was the most requested feature by developers, which makes perfect sense in 2020. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds though, he said this.
With PS5, the GPU was definitely the area we felt the most tension between adding new features and keeping a familiar programming model.
Then this, at 5 minutes and 6 seconds.
To me, the SSD really is the key to the next generation. It's a game changer.
And for the next 18 minutes, it was all about the PlayStation 5's solid-state drive. First of all, we got comparisons between the old mechanical hard drive in the PS4 versus the upcoming SSD. Most of this stuff is nothing new to PC users who've had SSDs for around about 10 years already. The major difference this time around is that the PlayStation 5 appears to be set up to heavily utilise the SSD as a tool for fast streaming assets. On the PC, we're really using it for storage and obviously the page file. And we saw examples of current game developers being hamstrung somewhat with long loading times and the inability to effectively stream assets quickly. If any of you ever played Mass Effect 1 on the PC, you'll know how long the elevator rides took. Forever, basically. This was because it took so long for the levels to stream assets into RAM from the mechanical hard disk, and nobody actually had an SSD back then. Another example of this would be World of Warcraft, where you often have long twisting tunnels from one area to the next. The reasoning behind this is that if you're in that tunnel heading in a certain direction, chances are you're going to go all the way through, and the game can preload the next area's assets while you're running through it. Now, SSDs pretty much did away with the worst of this. However, it is still a design issue on the current generation consoles. Not any longer. And in fact, Sony appear to be taking it further. A lot further. This is what Cerny said.
What if the SSD is so fast that as the player is turning around, it's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second? If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen.
Now, I'm not entirely convinced by a half second to turn argument. What if you're jump shooting, for instance? However, the point is clear enough. Essentially, Sony reckon that with an SSD fast enough, it can become an extension of RAM. That could lead to some amazing visuals, and it'll be interesting to see just how good the technology is in a couple of years, once the developers get used to it. Again, this is all stuff that could be done on a PC, and it is of course in some ways. However, the PC is somewhat hamstrung by its lack of a closed ecosystem. A PlayStation 5 developer knows exactly what he has to work with. All PCs are different. Some might have a 5 GB per second SSD, others might have a 2 GB per second SSD, some might be running the game from a mechanical hard drive, and in general, the lowest common denominator wins. So this was part of what Cerny called the dream of the SSD, with blazing fast loading times obviously being yet another clear advantage. At the 16-minute mark, we learned that Sony's SSD is only 825 GB. It's never good to lose a numbers game, and the Series X 1TB is larger than 825 GB. This was a design and cost choice. These 12 flash dies connecting to Sony's proprietary flash controller is what allows for the higher bandwidth of the PS5's SSD, 5.5 GB per second, which is more than twice as fast as the Xbox Series X. In this case, the additional speed is by far the more preferable choice, over say another 150 GB or so. But again, it is not as easy to market. 5.5 GB per second requires PCIe Gen 4, which Sony's flash controller has, while Microsoft look like they are still on Gen 3. And I also wondered at this point if we were seeing the beginnings of Sony's entire strategy on this coming generation. They know they will have a much faster SSD, and they feel that they can get the developers to utilise it in almost real time, as it were. This is something that Microsoft will struggle to contend with. Now, just before the 18-minute mark, we were treated to this slide, which had some in my Patreon Discord querying if the PS5 could be chiplet-based. I long suggested it would be, of course, but I also long since gave up on that idea. It's hard to argue against what we're seeing here though, as the main custom chip has what appears to be 3 separate elements of GPU, CPU, and this large I/O complex. The I/O complex actually contains 2 coprocessors. Not based on Zen 2 though, and I wonder if those are ARM or Jaguar based instead. Don't get me wrong, on a personal level, I'd be delighted if it were a chiplet setup. I just don't think so, and I gave up on that idea some time ago. The final part of note about the long section on SSD was that Sony would also support commercial SSD drives. M.2 SSDs available on the common market, and interestingly, they will be able to take advantage of the PlayStation 5's flash controller chip. There is a caveat though, SSDs will need to be faster than the PlayStation 5's in order for the gameplay experience to remain consistent. I wonder if Sony is concerned about longevity here, as their ideas certainly appear to revolve more around constant SSD accessing, which as we know will reduce its life. It was all pretty interesting stuff to be honest, though it likely went over the heads of most console gamers. That balancing evolution and revolution slide appeared on screen again, and I had the feeling that we were about to get the information, which I, for one, was looking forward to most. Mark didn't disappoint as he finally went on to talk about the new console's graphics. The next slide shows what he meant by evolution and revolution, before we got confirmation that the PlayStation 5 would, like the Xbox Series X, use a custom RDNA 2 based AMD GPU. That would have been a relief to some because for a long time there were rumours of the PlayStation 5 being based on RDNA 1, and there was also a persisting rumour of some hybrid RDNA 1.5 thing. But then, at 26.5 minutes, Cerny said this.
This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well.
By this point, it was pretty apparent that Microsoft, with their 52 compute units, had built a more powerful GPU. The only question was how much more powerful. And things appeared to get even worse as Cerny next noted that the PlayStation 5 GPU would be backwards compatible with the PlayStation 4's. Only the PlayStation 4's, while Microsoft were already showing demos of original Xbox games running on the Series X, and not just running flawlessly but now also upscaled in resolution and running HDR, which didn't even exist at the time. Again, I'll talk about this later in my analysis of the information. Cerny saying that almost all of the top 100 games should be playable, that doesn't really seem anywhere near as good. He then talked a little about Sony's Geometry engine, which looks like a rebrand of AMD's new RDNA 2 tech. However, the details were pretty scant. One thing that did stand out to me though was this.
Another major new feature of our custom RDNA 2 based GPU is ray tracing, using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs.
Ray tracing using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs. Now, I don't know about you, but that appears to only really mean one thing to me, as AMD's ray tracing strategy clearly evolves around DXR. Microsoft's DXR. And in my last analysis video again, I speculated that this could be very bad news for Sony's ray tracing initiatives. If DXR isn't AMD's ray tracing strategy, then what is it? Why did AMD show this demo of a Navi GPU running DXR? But anyway, we got some clarification of what is inside the hardware, as Mark details Sony's intersection engine, which again looks like it's a rebrand of the fixed function BVH traversal hardware in RDNA 2. It was interesting that he pointed out that this was memory intensive and would incur a penalty, though the claim later was that they had already seen a PlayStation 5 title with ray trace based reflections in complex animated scenes, with only a modest performance penalty. And again, I'll undoubtedly be looking at ray tracing in far more depth in the future, but for now, this is pretty much what we had to go on. And all that was left by now was the final reveal of the specs. Over the past year or so, we've had leaks on some very high clock speed parts, labelled as AMD Gonzalo. And the first part we saw appeared to be clocked at 1.8 GHz. That is based on this 18 number here. Nobody really believed we'd see anywhere near 1.8 GHz on a console though, so it was all a little bit strange. But then a bit later, an extremely compelling leak turned up. Something called Oberon A0. This A0 would be the silicon revision, and 3 generations complete with clock speeds. And the fact that these latter 2 clock speeds lined up exactly with the PlayStation 4 Pro and the PlayStation 4 seemed to be more than just coincidence, and the speculation was that these clocks were some kind of compatibility mode for the new PlayStation 5, which was now running at 2 GHz. 2 GHz? That just seemed like pure fantasy, based on what we knew about Navi and the 5700 XT. But then again, right at the end of 2019, the famous GitHub leak appeared, detailing a 36 compute unit GPU running at 2 GHz. And that leak also contained information on a 3584 shader part, which is 56 compute units, presumably for the upcoming Xbox. I analysed this a couple of months ago in my AMD on 7nm video, and while I was still clearly having a hard time believing that those specs could be real, simply based on Navi's current performance per watt, I also said that I had no choice but to believe it. So overwhelming was the evidence by this point. So I wasn't really surprised when Cerny started the performance part of the presentation with this.
Another set of issues for the GPU involved size and frequency. How big do we make the GPU, and what frequency do we run it at? In general, I like running the GPU at higher frequency. Let me show you why. Here's two possible configurations for a GPU roughly of the level of the PlayStation 4 Pro. This is a thought experiment. Don't take these configurations too seriously. If you just calculate teraflops, you get the same number. But actually, the performance is noticeably different because teraflops is defined as the computational capability of the vector ALU. That's just one part of the GPU. There are a lot of other units. And those other units all run faster when the GPU frequency is higher. At 33% higher frequency, rasterization goes 33% faster. Processing the command buffer goes that much faster. The L2 and other caches have that much higher bandwidth, and so on.
While true, the reality here is that the number of shaders are by far a more reliable indicator of performance, at least so long as the bottleneck isn't at the front end, the command processor or in rasterization. A good example of where we did see that though would have been GCN, which was forever limited by its ability to feed the large amount of shaders some of their cards had. And that is also why AMD's teraflops long failed to match Nvidia's teraflops when it came to gaming. Maxwell had a large clock speed advantage, and then Pascal even more. And that's one reason why Nvidia were able to run rings around various AMD GPUs, which had higher flops. RDNA 1 appeared to have fixed the worst of this for AMD though, and their teraflops are now much closer to Nvidia's in terms of gaming bang per flop. Had this not been fixed, then sure, the higher clock speed part could have been a huge benefit to Sony. But when the front end isn't the bottleneck any longer, 30% faster rasterization simply isn't gonna cut it when you're down 30% in shader performance against your competitor. And so when Cerny finally announced only a 36 compute unit part running at an eye-watering 2.23 GHz and now 10.3 teraflops, I wondered if Sony had gambled on AMD failing to improve their front end with RDNA 2. Note though that unlike the Series X GPU, which is locked at 1825 MHz, the PS5's GPU is capped at 2.23 GHz. Interestingly though, he said that they actually had to hold the clocks back for power reasons, which bodes extremely well for AMD's upcoming 6000 series GPUs. And he also said that while this was the maximum clock, in most cases they've seen it runs very close to this speed. In this video that I was making but didn't, I was ready to speculate on Sony pushing their 36 compute unit to the limits in order to win back some performance. And this seemed even more likely after I dug up this article over at Bloomberg in February, stating that the PlayStation 5 build costs have risen to $450 per unit, noting that the cooling system is unusually expensive at a few dollars per unit. Typically, companies would spend less than $1, but Sony opted to lavish more on ensuring heat dissipation from the powerful chips housed inside the console isn't an issue. And of course, the easiest way of ensuring you need better cooling is by pushing a GPU to near its limits. Both companies have done this with their next generation. However, Microsoft did it the smart way. And finally, the PlayStation 5 CPU, that same 8-core 16-thread Zen 2 based CPU, is capped at 3.5 GHz, with Cerny citing AVX2 as one possible workload for why they can't cap it like Microsoft are. It doesn't really wash with me though. And the last 15 minutes or so covered the PlayStation 5's audio, which looks pretty cool, but I'm not going to cover it for time reasons. And so, with that, let's get on to the summary. The next generation console battle will be fought over many years, but both of these companies are well aware that the first round is incredibly important, and Microsoft have clearly won the initial exchanges, and for a while it looked like Sony might not even get off the ropes. All of this was caused by the graphics portion of each console. If you follow any of the next-gen console threads, you'll see how multiple supposed sources continued to make claims of much higher performance for the PlayStation 5, but that was clearly just wishful thinking. Sony must have decided very early to run with a 36 compute unit part, and Microsoft with 56 or 52. All of those leaks that we saw in the past were true. Just because Sony are launching at 2.23 GHz capped doesn't mean that the 2 GHz and 1.8 GHz leaks were false. It simply means that 1.8 GHz and 2 GHz were the aim at one point, and for once AMD appears to have over-delivered on performance per watt. But Microsoft have been able to get at least 18% higher teraflops because they were the ones willing to pay for this large APU. And note that this is a lot smaller than I imagined it would be. So I wonder if we're looking at another density improvement from 7nm enhanced. As I said, I thought 400 plus. It's only 360 though, which is at least 10% smaller and maybe closer to 15% smaller than what I had thought probable. Microsoft have got an extremely potent GPU and 8 Zen 2 cores in a pretty reasonably sized package. On top of that, Microsoft built a chassis that could house something that bit more powerful, and that's what's allowed them to lock the clock speeds on both the CPU and GPU. And the difference in CPU is the interesting one here because that is apples to apples, yet Microsoft appear to be getting at least 100 MHz more locked. That simply comes down to the better cooling. And regarding the PlayStation 5 APU, Sony appear to have hamstrung themselves due to this backward compatibility thing that they always seem to have going on. You remember the PlayStation 4 Pro and its butterfly design? Built that way to accommodate the 700 existing PlayStation 4 titles. The PlayStation 5 and its identical compute unit to the PlayStation 4 Pro appears to have been at least partway built due to that. But this time, all Sony can say is that the top 100 PlayStation 4 games should work on the PlayStation 5. Meanwhile, Microsoft seem to be able to do all this backward compatibility in software, all the way back to even the initial Xbox, except now those titles run upscaled with HDR. And the amusing thing about this is, didn't Microsoft's Phil Spencer say that they wouldn't sacrifice future performance for backward compatibility? Microsoft got both right. Sony appear to have got both wrong. 36 compute units at higher clock speed? Yep, that could have worked out better for them had AMD again failed with their GPU. But they obviously haven't, and then some. And while I don't believe that the final game benchmarks will show a massive lead for Microsoft, they should be ahead in most games. And ray tracing looks to be on the side of Microsoft too. They've got the DXR API. What does Sony have? Are PS5 devs going to have to code to the metal for ray tracing? If so, I think Microsoft could have yet another performance advantage there. And by virtue of the fact that there are more compute units on the Series X APU, the ray tracing performance is going to be around that much better as well. But remember, Microsoft also said that performance alone wouldn't define this generation. And Sony does have a better SSD, even though it's a little bit smaller. It is more than twice as fast. And this controller with 12 memory chips, that probably didn't come very cheap. And that may be another reason for why they have opted for a smaller GPU, but are still apparently struggling with cost. If it's going to cost $450 to build, they need to sell it for $470. And price will be, again, a major factor in what people decide to buy. And price will be a major factor in my decision on what to buy as well. And though I'm probably coming off as a Microsoft fanboy to some of you, that is clearly not the case. I am, however, a big fan of what they appear to have achieved with the Series X. But I am also still interested in the PlayStation 5. And if they can get this SSD thing to work for them, if their audio is as nice as they're making it out to be, a little bit lacking in performance, it's maybe not so bad that it would be the deciding factor. If they are close on price though, I think the Xbox would win. And look, I know that for many of you, you're basically locked into Sony because of backwards compatibility and platform exclusives. So even the price won't matter to you. And while the PlayStation 5 might not be as cool as the Xbox, Sony are just a little bit cooler than Microsoft, let's be honest. I'd like to see both of these consoles selling 100 million units at least. But whatever happens now, I hope at least Microsoft gets some reward for pushing the boundaries of what is capable in a console. But with that said, if all of this has come at the cost of $599, it's probably not been worth it. I think it'll be $499 though, and it'll be interesting to see who blinks first with a price reveal, which will be the final part of this console puzzle. I'll catch you later, guys.